I'm going to talk about the relationship of the different churches of the Middle East, the historical churches of the Middle East, and in this case, the breakdown of relations between the different churches took place in the 5th and 6th century. And it's only in the late 20th century that things began to take a better look. So mine is much more historical, going back long into the past. And I hope you've all got the sheet, because the identities of all these people, all these churches, is quite complicated. What is at stake from the point of view of my talk is that there are three groups. There was this three-way split in Middle Eastern Christianity that goes back to the 5th, 6th century. We think normally of a two-way split between Latin East and Latin West and Greek East sometime in the course of the Middle Ages, allegedly 1054, but of course it's a process, and it's the same thing is also the case in the 5th, 6th century. It didn't all happen suddenly. It was a process. So we've got three different Middle Eastern traditions. I'll start with the Chalcedonian, because that's what we all are, or the vast majority of us are. People who accept the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And so I've put in bold letters the Syriac ones of the Chalcedonian, so Maronite, Syrian, Catholic, Chaldean. And then the largest other group is the Oriental Orthodox, the Syrian Orthodox, but also, and the vast majority, are Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Malankara. The Syrian Orthodox is actually numerically very small compared with some of the others, above all Coptic and the Malankara Orthodox in India. And then the other end of the theological spectrum is the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East and the Ancient Church of the East. And these are the only two churches of that tradition. Now, there's a great confusion about the way these churches are referred to. Because the controversy goes back to the 5th, 6th century, a lot of the polemical terms that were used at that period got fossilized, as did the positions, when the Arab invasions of the 7th century took place. And these polemic names, you called people by the worst terms, your enemies, your theological enemies, by the worst terms you could think. Unfortunately, these got fossilized in the Middle Ages and also in the Western European historiographical church history tradition. So those of you who were brought up in church history, well, I didn't know how many years ago, but probably anything more than about 20 years ago, will have known the names Nestorian, Jacobite, Monophysite, and so on. Well, one thing that ecumenical dialogue has done, not all that successfully, I shall illustrate that, is that it has emphasized the need to call people by the right terms and not to use terms which are actually often theologically misleading and cause great confusion and continue to cause great confusion. So I jotted down on this list the main misleading and inappropriate terms. So don't use Jacobite, don't use Monophysite for the Syrian and Oriental Orthodox churches, and for the Church of the East, don't use Nestorian. There's no point in going into the reasons why, because they're quite complicated. Instead of Monophysite, the modern term, which is much better because it's not misleading, is Miaphysite. And this it was invented, I forget who invented it, it's only about 20 years old, but it means one nature. It's the churches which believe that the incarnate Christ has one nature out of two, human and divine. It's a combined nature. Whereas the Chalcedonian position is that the incarnate Christ exists in two natures. And that is also the position of the Church of the East, who have a different approach and a different reason for disliking the Council of Chalcedon. So Miaphysite is much the best term for the Oriental Orthodox. And then you can call all the Chalcedonian churches Diophysite, with two natures, those who held the two natures. So the controversies that we have today, ecumenical dialogue, which is trying to overcome these, all go back to two councils in the 5th century. The Council of Ephesus in 431, which is not acceptable to the Church of the East, but is one of the received councils of all the other churches. The Oriental Orthodox have 3 councils, which they regard as ecumenical, of which Ephesus is the 3rd. Then in 451, the Council of Chalcedon. The emperor was hoping to bring together all the different viewpoints on Christology. How do you describe the relationship of the divinity to the humanity in the incarnate Christ? And although the Chalcedonian definition is a very carefully worked out piece of writing, it unfortunately includes 2 terms which were ambiguous, and this is the cause of all the trouble. The 2 terms are physis, nature, so that's why we've got one nature, two natures, Christologies, and the other term is hypostasis. That's the problem in the case of the Church of the East. Well, I'm not going into the details of how to sort this out, but modern ecumenical dialogue has had one great achievement. It has realized that under the conflicting terminology, all the sides have the same understanding beneath the terminology of the incarnation. And I shall say something about alternative forms to the Chalcedonian definition later on. So the 5th, 6th, and I suppose also early 7th century was this period when these divisions were becoming firm. There's no clear date when this happens, but one very important thing was the ecclesiastical policy of the Emperor Justinian. That's already into the 6th century. He came to the throne in 527. Now, Justinian wanted to have uniformity in church, in the Christian church of his day, so he imposes the Council of Chalcedon as if you were to become a bishop, you had to accept the Council of Chalcedon, as well as sign a document. In fact, you did have to sign a document. They were called libelli. And that likewise, if you were going to be a priest in a diocese under a bishop who had signed the libelli, then you too had to agree. So this is imposing Chalcedon on the Christian church of the time. And this was when things sort of fell apart, because people who didn't like Chalcedon, of course, didn't like that. Before that, it hadn't been at all clear which way the empire or the emperors would go. Some emperors took a more anti-Chalcedonian stance. Others took a stance that they wanted to avoid all mention of these key terms, physis, nature, and hypostasis. But unfortunately, there was a very good statement, imperial statement by the Emperor Zeno in 482 called the Henoticon, which was supposed to bring people together, and it carefully avoided all these problematic terms. But unfortunately, hardliners on either side made sure that that didn't work. But it's interesting too that Justinian, who was a very good theologian himself, he was very eager to bring together the different sides, and he did so in 532. He organized a colloquium in Constantinople with Chalcedonian and Miaphysite bishops, and he tried to bring the two together. In fact, the Diophysite position at that time was actually very close to the Miaphysite position, and there were many theologians amongst the Chalcedonians who would be very happy to say you can either be a Miaphysite or Diophysite. It all hung on one little letter in Greek. It's one nature, ek, out of two natures, or one or two natures, in two. So that's ek and en in Greek. So it's just one letter. Well, Justinian wanted to bring people together. He had this ecumenical dialogue, you could say, in Constantinople in 532, and remarkably we have an account of the proceedings from both sides, and it's very interesting to compare them. Theologically, the Chalcedonians and the Miaphysites were happy with each other, but then Justinian puts in what breaks everything down. He said, if you Miaphysite bishops want to regain your sees, then you must sign this libellus accepting Chalcedon, which of course they didn't want to. So that it was a good example of how not to conduct ecumenical relations. It was one side dominating the other, and that is a lesson which is sometimes worth people remembering in modern dialogue. Two modern observers of church history at this period, it seems that people were talking about footling differences, and it's very hard for the modern Christians to understand why these issues were so much fought over and caused such trouble in the Eastern Roman Empire. I mean, there were riots and there was murders and lynchings and all sorts of things. It was a complete breakdown. The reasons are, then this only came to me after I'd studied the subject for many years. It's a question of your salvation, and it's a question of how you see salvation coming about. And there are two different conceptual models, as it were. For the Miaphysite position, where you have out of two natures, one incarnate, one composite incarnate nature, the key point of God becoming human is at the moment of conception. And so from the very conception of the incarnate Christ, that is salvation, that is, as it were, the mode of salvation for humanity. It's seen as the most important point. Whereas for the Diophysite tradition, It's very important to, at least analytically, mentally, keep apart the human nature and the divine nature in the incarnate Christ. And it's only at the ascension that these two natures are united, and that it is that uniting of the two natures that brings about salvation. So that, I think, explains why people felt so strongly, if they had one or other of these two conceptual models, and they didn't, as it were, see that both are necessary, because they thought only one was necessary. This was really why people felt so very strongly about it. In fact, if you read the liturgical traditions of all the different forms, you'll find, as it were, support for both conceptual models. And from a modern point of view, it's not a case of either or, but of both and. Well, as I mentioned, the Arab invasions in the 7th century and the gradual Islamicization of medieval society, and it's important to remember that this was a gradual process. And at first, for several centuries, there was still a Christian majority and a Muslim minority in the Middle East. And it was only about the 10th, 11th century that the tables turned. Now, a few cases in the course of the Middle Ages, you have of individuals, only individuals, recognizing that these three different positions, have become ecclesial positions, were basically the same. There's a very famous polymath scholar of the Syrian Orthodox tradition called Bar Hebreus or Bar Ebroio in the 13th century, and he has a beautiful passage where he draws attention to the underlying the three positions over the terms nature and hypostasis, that they're all actually saying this or trying to say the same thing. And there are a few other figures like Bar Hebreus in the Armenian tradition, in the Coptic tradition, and so on, but this was exceptional. There was no real dialogue in Middle Ages, or indeed any time up to the latter part of the 20th century. Now, in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, it's important to know what type of dialogue is taking place. And essentially, there are three different types of dialogue. You have the non-official dialogue. So this is where you have theologians from different parties, from different churches, talking freely. They're not committing themselves to anything, but they're trying to reach a satisfactory, often they try to provide a communique at the end of their dialogue, or each dialogue. And then if these non-official dialogues are sufficiently successful, then that's the moment for official dialogue to take place. And this is much more difficult to achieve because everyone's on edge, as it were. And both non-official and official dialogue can have two types. They can either be bilateral, that's between, say, one church, the Catholic Church, and, say, the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, or one of the Oriental Orthodox. Or they can be multilateral, that's, say, Catholic and all the Oriental Orthodox. And this is extremely difficult to achieve. And then, so non-official, official, which can be bilateral, multilateral. And then you have a third type, and that is where it's the reigning Pope issuing a statement with a patriarch of one of the Oriental Orthodox churches, or the Church of the East. So we've got various possibilities, and they've all taken place in the course of the last just over half a century. The beginnings were, in fact, nothing to do with the Western churches. It was the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox who got together in 1964, a non-official dialogue. And it was only in the next year, so this is right at the end of Vatican II, and it was thanks to the foundation by Cardinal Koenig of Austria, Vienna. He saw with great vision that there was a great need for dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox. They were what was in mind at that time, so the Greek and Russian tradition and so on. And he founded this place in Austria and Vienna, Pro Oriente Foundation, which was to promote Christian unity and promote dialogue between the Catholic and various Eastern churches. So the very next year, 1965, you have the first meeting, ecumenical meeting on the Catholic side, sort of non-official, arranged by Pro Oriente with the Eastern Orthodox. So that doesn't yet involve any of the non-Chalcedonian churches. It wasn't until 1971 that Pro Oriente turned its attention to the non-Chalcedonian churches, and in 1971 they initiated a number of meetings with Oriental Orthodox theologians. And this did very good work. From the very beginning, on Christology, they made some very good statements on Christology, and there's a famous statement which is known as the Vienna Christological Statement, which has been very influential later on and is often in these non-official dialogues. Statements of the Ecumenics are taken up in official dialogue, sometimes adapted. Anyhow, they're a very important basis. Then, 1974, we have the first official dialogue with a non-Chalcedonian church. This is Catholic and Coptic Orthodox. From 1974 to 1992, when things broke down for various reasons, there were a number of meetings between the two on an official level. For the Syriac churches, the real beginning was in 1994, again an initiative of Pro Oriente, and this was an initiative called Syriac Dialogue. And this was an amazing event because it brought together theologians you shouldn't use the term representative in non-official dialogue, brought together theologians from all the different churches of Syriac liturgical tradition. So that's the Syrian Orthodox, Syrian Catholic, Maronite, Church of the East, and Chaldean. And the situation in India is even more complicated than in the Middle East, but there were representatives from India, but not to complicated matters, I won't go into that. So, for the first time first time ever, I suppose, you had all these different Syriac churches, ranging from the Miaphysite to the Church of the East, which there's complete opposite ends of the theological spectrum on Christology, brought together And there were three very important meetings of this Syriac dialogue. It turned out to be very successful, in fact too successful from the point of view of certain members of the Coptic Orthodox Church, including Patriarch Shenouda, and just at the point when things seemed to be going wonderfully, it all collapsed. And well, it simply stood still. It didn't collapse, and the work had been done, but there was no possibility of continuing at that point. So that's from 1994 to 1997. 1994 also saw a very important development, and that's the non-official dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Church of the East. This was the first time that the Church of the East, which had been left out on a limb in ecumenical relations, the first time the Church of the East had even though it was on a non-official level, had, as it were, semi-official relationship with another church. So from the Church of the East point of view, this was terribly important. It was, they are being recognized for the first time. And this was all the more important because in the Middle East Council of Churches at this time, the Assyrian Church of the East had been excluded, and it was not a member. This was the most shocking thing. And this, I'm sorry to say, was due to the Coptic Orthodox Patriarch of the time, Pope Shenouda. I don't think this this matter of the Middle East Church, Council of Middle East Churches, has yet been resolved fully. But anyhow, it was at a very bad stage at that point. So this made for the Church of the East, this relationship with the Catholic Church was extremely important. 1994 also saw the first Reformed and Oriental Orthodox non-official dialogue. But going back to the Catholic and Church of the East dialogue, non-official dialogue, this had a remarkable outcome. In 2001, the Vatican issued a series of guidelines, if I got the right wording, so it's quite important. Guidelines for admission to the Eucharist between the Chaldean and the ancient Church of the East. That doesn't sound terribly exciting and very local, but in fact it was a remarkable set of guidelines, and what it in effect did, it made one of the Eucharistic liturgies of the Church of the East, the oldest one, the liturgy of Adar and Mari, it regarded that as an authentic liturgy, even though it has no institution narrative. Now, from a Western point of view, this sounds pretty scandalous, and especially in scholastic tradition. But if you look at the Eastern Orthodox tradition, where historically the epiclesis, the invocation of the Holy Spirit, is the more important point, the Adar and Mari has very good epiclesis, so it's not so surprising. But then if you turn to the tradition of anaphoras, liturgies, Eucharistic liturgies in the Syriac world, and there are about 80 in the Syrian Orthodox tradition, you'll find that in fact there are a number of parallels to this. Of course, they're not so well known because they're slightly later, but Adar and Mari is certainly the most ancient Eucharistic liturgy in current use today, and it has been throughout the centuries. So this recognition of the anaphora of Adar and Mari is hugely important. it's been extremely controversial, and there's been a lot of complaints from more conservative circles. So that is a very important event. What I'm sorry to say I forgot to put down, this was put together rather at the last minute. I was going away, I was away last week. In 2004, this a very important development. This was the beginning of official dialogue between Catholic and the Oriental Orthodox, but this time not on a bilateral level between just two Catholic and Church of the East, or Catholic and Syrian Orthodox. This is multilateral, much more difficult to achieve, and it started in 2004 and is continuing. Now the third form of dialogue is within the Vatican, the reigning Pope and visiting Oriental patriarchs. And there had been meetings already in the 1960s, late 1960s, 1967 and 1970, with visiting Armenian bishops. I think it wasn't with the Catholicos, but the first time with a patriarch of an Oriental Orthodox church was in 1971, Patriarch Jakub of the Syrian Orthodox Church. And then 2 years later, a statement with Patriarch Shenouda of the Coptic Orthodox Church. And perhaps more important was quite a long and detailed Christological statement, and also a pastoral statement in 1984 with the next Syrian Orthodox Patriarch, the late Patriarch Zaka Iwas. That same year, it so happened that the Catholicos Patriarch of the Church East was in Europe, and he visited the Pope in 1984, but it was no more than a meeting, but it did start things off. And in 1994, he again met the Pope, this time Pope John Paul II, and there's a very useful and worthwhile Christological statement from that. And since then, there have been similar statements with the Catholicosity, Armenian Catholicosity of Ecumenism and of Silesia, 1996 and 7. And then a further agreement with in 2000 with Ecumenism. Now, I've been talking mainly about Christology. Of course, these ecumenical meetings deal with many other things, but they always have to start off with Christology, and rightly so, because historically that's what led to the divisions. But when they've reached some sort of agreement about that, and as I said earlier, they usually reach agreement that the conflicting wording is only a surface confliction, and that the underlying understanding is very similar. Other topics, in fact, in modern society are much more controversial, namely ecclesiology, authority, primacy, and so on. But all these get discussed at these meetings. Now, just end with a few reflections. In the case of dialogue with the Oriental Orthodox, it's only natural to begin with Chalcedon, since that is the main point that brought about the division. Unfortunately, when the Church of the East was brought into the dialogue, Chalcedon was still the focus of attention. And I was at the first two of the Syriac dialogue meetings as an academic advisor. And as I felt at the time, the Church of the East was being put on trial. How did it, what was its attitude to Chalcedon and especially to Ephesus? Ephesus had actually played quite an important part in the Vienna Christological statement, and this actually caused problems for Syriac dialogue with the Church of the East. So the emphasis on Chalcedon with the dialogue with the Church of the East is actually doubly unfortunate, because the Church of the East was historically outside the Roman Empire, and it's very important to remember that ecumenical councils in antiquity were councils convened by the Roman Emperor, Byzantine Emperor, and had no authority outside the Roman Empire. So the Church of the East simply wasn't involved in any of these councils. And so it's, in my view, very unfortunate if these councils are used as the basis for the dialogue. Now, in all this discussion on Christology, one needs to know what is the aim. Is it uniformity? Does everyone have to agree and accept with the doctrinal formulation of Chalcedon? It seems to me that this is a misguided aim, and I think most people have realized that that is so. Another way of looking at it, again from a Chalcedonian perspective, is recognition of unity of belief based on different formulations using the Chalcedonian terminology, i.e. physis, nature, and hypostasis, but properly understood. So it's one church recognizing that the other's understanding of a different understanding of these terms is acceptable once it's interpreted in the way that that other church accepts it. And that is something I think that was certainly achieved in the Syriac dialogue in the times that I was present at the meetings. And I would myself prefer, and I think many people would prefer, an agreement of unity of belief based on a formulation that's different from that of Chalcedon. So I have great sympathy for the Emperor Zeno's Henoticon, which avoided the controversial terms. And such a unity of belief would be expressed in using completely other terms, and a whole number of different possibilities have been suggested. Many of them seem to me excellent, but unfortunately you'll find that especially amongst the Eastern Orthodox, the more conservative people, the theologians amongst them, do not like that. They want everything using the Chalcedonian terminology. Since time is running on, one final observation. Now, all that I've been talking about, these ecumenical dialogues, these have been conducted, as it were, by the theological elites of all the different churches. What is very important to remember is that this old saying of lex orandi, lex credendi, the liturgy and the understanding of Christology and of theology and Trinitarian theology in the liturgy is extremely important. Now, it's true that in many of these dialogues this has been taken into account, but it seems to be in the, as it were, the making the findings of these dialogues known to ordinary parishes. It's this aspect of the presence of within the liturgy that's used by the local communities and congregations that the Christology is expressed through prayer. And so it's actually noticeable if you analyze the Vienna Christological formula of 1974, which has been extremely influential in official dialogue much later. You can actually say this comes from some very theological statement in the 5th century, whereas this comes from a liturgical text, and this comes also from a liturgical text. So the people who drew up that were very aware of it, but it is often, it seems to me, the case that the actual practicalities of liturgical life are equally important to take into consideration. So thank you for listening.